So the agenda for this session that's often allowed is simple. I'll talk as an analyst about how we view the LT market shaping up for about 10 or 15 minutes, which is not nearly enough time, but that's what we're given. And then we have a couple of vendors who will then come on and give their feel about how they view the LT world and their contributions to it. Have some Q&A, and hopefully during the presentation, you in the audience can say some few questions as well for that part of the presentation. With that, let's take a look at the numbers. Next slide, please. Every analyst presentation has to start with a complicated slide like this one, full of lots of numbers. But in fact, the message is quite simple. The message of this slide is really the message of my presentation. That is, LTE is not taking over the world anytime soon. Let's remember what LTE stands for, long-term evolution. It's going to take quite a long time to get there. One point to notice, though, is that LTE and mobile WiMAX used to be considered prime, both equally comparable candidates, prime candidates for 4G just 2 or 3 years ago. And now, as you can see, mobile WiMAX has really been reduced something like a mosquito on an elephant as far as its role in the mobile broadband ecosystem. LTE, as of 2011, accounts for something like 0.3% of, will account for something like 0.3% of mobile broadband connections worldwide. That's not a lot. Obviously, there's a lot more hype going into it, a lot more activity, a lot of R&D, a lot of patent filing. So the 0.3% obviously doesn't reflect its real importance in the industry. But nonetheless, let's accurately portray what's going on in the network today. By 2015, we estimate something like 11% connection. Mobile broadband connection will be on LTE. Mobile broadband only. There's another 4 billion or so just in 2010 that are not mobile broadband. The GSM and second generation CDMA connection. So that's LTE is still quite a small part of the market in 2015. What should shine out to you in this slide is the important role of HSPA, not only today, but even more so in 2015. This is really where the market is heading. HSPA has really brought the benefits of 3G. You have to build up the slide. Next. Thank you. HSPA has really brought the benefits of 3G to end users that everyone had hoped WCD may deliver, but unfortunately failed to, in terms of speed, coverage, a better user experience, a wide range of devices, including dongles, laptops, and so on. And HSPA in the standard bodies and in terms of how vendors have developed it and their equipment has evolved to the point where the payoff for deploying LTE separately from HSPA Plus isn't always so clear. So back to slide 2. Okay, back to slide 3. Okay, that's fine. So let me explain a bit why we think HSPA is going to be still so important in the market as of 2015 and beyond. Yes, if you look at the standards evolution, and if you look at the vendor's roadmap, if you look at the operator roadmap, LTE is the natural successor to the UMTS HSPA family. But that doesn't mean that we need it tomorrow or anytime soon, at least not every country member or an operator. LTE is not, as a rule anyways, always faster than HSPA Plus. To somewhat oversimplify the issue, focusing in on one metric, that is spectrum. Spectrum is really the most important factor in terms of the actual bandwidth, downstream bandwidth that you're going to get an LTE. So if you look at the regular awards and doing 1.4 megahertz slice of spectrum, then the real speeds may be something less than 20 megabits per second. If you get to the maximum allowable in the standard 20 megahertz slice of spectrum, yes, you might get 100 megabits per second downstream in ideal conditions. Okay, that's nice. But let's take a look at HSPA Plus. HSPA Plus already delivers speeds of 42 megabits per second using something called DC or dual carrier HSPA, which is actually what CSL wants to do. And there's another variant of this under release 9 of BGP that ramps up to 84 megabits per second. And looking at what Docomo is doing in its LTE deployment, it's actually achieving 37 megabits per second in its pure LTE deployment, less than what CSL is claiming for HSPA plus using DCSPA. So there's a trade-off here in investment, and it really depends on the operator-specific situation as to which technology to deploy in the network. Next slide, please. So let's also consider the issue of services and applications. Does LTE offer or provide us any killer applications that maybe just be a plus does not? As far as we can see today, and no analyst can see the future, unfortunately, we can only make educated guesses. We don't see any specific killer app for LTE. The main benefit is more an amorphous user experience, which is a function of, yes, increased speeds, but not only that. Latency is a really important issue, which enables all sorts of applications that just don't work with the latency specs under HSPA+. Higher coding schemes will enhance the audio and video streaming quality that you can get. And this is an example of something that one operator is doing in Europe. They did Telecom Austria put together a telepresence trial mid-last year, where it connected some of its engineers. It's more of an internal demo. Some of its engineers in Vienna, with colleagues in several other cities, over LTE. That's something that probably would not be available, be doable simply because of the latency issue over HSPA+. Next slide, please. Okay, so no specific killer apps, maybe better user experience. How about new revenues? Well, as far as what we predict, we don't see revenue growth or new revenues. We don't see a specific new revenue stream enabled by LTE. One thing that a lot of operators are looking for, and certainly a lot of vendors are pushing, is the idea of M2M or the Internet of Things. We actually think this is probably going to be small for the service providers. Yes, the vendors that are making chips and the devices that are enabling M2M, that would be more attractive to them. But as far as the service providers making money from this, that is not likely to be significant. The more important point is maybe the second bullet here. This is probably contested. We don't have service providers in a room, I don't believe. But service providers still insist that their customers want to buy and are willing to pay for more than access. They're really hoping the customers will be willing to pay for applications and all sorts of other fancy things. But that really hasn't borne out in reality yet. In the fixed line world and in the mobile setting. It's always something that they're hoping will evolve in the future. So that's another limitation of revenue growth in LTE. As far as different prices for different speeds or QoS levels, that's also so far come to nothing for the most part. So most operators have had to find ways to ramp down the bandwidth consumption and the stresses on the impact on those to make the bandwidth costs in the network, as opposed to just charging more for the ones that are willing to pay. On the right side of this chart, you can see this juxtaposed two forecasts, different forecasts. One forecast of revenues from OVUM, one of traffic from Cisco, using exciting its the latest B&I forecast from Cisco. As you can see, sure, mobile data traffic is growing nice and fast. Not surprisingly, something like 90% for Cisco's forecast over the next 5 years. Mobile data revenues, however, 9% per year. So the traffic growth rate of 90% doesn't imply, obviously, a cost increase rate of 90%. But nonetheless, there's still a real stress, real pressure on operators now to balance out these two factors. Next build, please. Where LTE is much more promising is in terms of bottom line cost reduction. So we don't see a lot of improvements in terms of new revenues, but as far as bringing new cost efficiencies to the network, that's where it really comes in handy. So next slide, please. This is sometimes a hard argument for vendors to make because it's marketing. It's not so attractive to marketing guys to say it's going to reduce the cost of space with your network. But in fact, fortunately, I think the CFOs and company operators are a lot more influential nowadays than they used to be. So the fact that LTE brings new cost efficiencies is actually a real attractive feature, and it's something we'll explore in a few minutes in our Q&A session. So what are some of the benefits of LTE in terms of cost efficiency? Higher spectrum efficiency, much simpler and flatter overall network architecture, part of which is simple function of the fact that it's all IP from the outset. Able to support both TDD and MDD modes. Channel flexibility, smart antennas, self-organizing network features, which haven't really been explored too much by analyst firms or by operators so far. Lower latency, higher speed, and better QoS and QoS experience. Next slide, please. There's a problem though. Yes, ultimately, LTE in the network does lower the cost of running the network. However, achieving this cost reduction takes some time. And more importantly, it takes a lot of investments to get there. Time, money, effort, and also management focus to get there. Despite suggestions by some that LTE is kind of an evolution similar to the 2G to 3G evolution, it's much more than that. It's more of a revolution. Rolling out LTE involves being ready to take a series of quite costly measures in your network and in your operations across the board. From buying spectrum, from deploying a new radio access network. If you happen to have a software-defined radio-based RAM, then that may not be the case, but that's not the case for all operators. New mobile core network and IMS. Lots more backhaul capacity. This is already an issue right now with HSPA, but rolling out LTE on top of that, especially LTE is data-focused only, even though it doesn't bring the need to support voice, carrying voice over that backhaul that you need to do if it's data and voice. Still, you need to carry that capacity in the network. Service continuity of existing services, coming up with some kind of new business model. They want BSS, and you have subsidized service, subsidized devices. That's a costly thing for any carrier. One thing I didn't mention here is actually training your workforce. That's something that has been a real issue in wireline networks as they evolve towards all IP and say, for example, transmission networks. And that's something also we're going to get into in the next section. I'm not sure that local operators are really fully prepared to deal with that. Teaching their engineers how to deal with all IP networks. Next slide, please. So, I'm not an LTE naysayer. In fact, LTE has plenty of momentum, and we are on an eventual path towards LTE in the network. That is still where the world is headed. It has plenty of momentum. Just a brief recap of some of the commercial contracts to date in this slide. But this doesn't show trials and demos and hero experience. This shows actual LTE contracts by vendor with the major operators on the right side. A few to point out, the more important ones are probably AT&T and Verizon in the US, since those, or at least Verizon already went live last year. Docomo also went live late 2010 as did CSL in Hong Kong. Net4 Mobility, under the Huawei heading, is I believe it's a joint venture between Telenor and another operator. I'll remember in a minute. Which the operators are sharing the RAN and deploying their own business models on top of that, separately, competing with each other. and that was also deployed in late 2010. So there's a bit of momentum in terms of LTE networks actually going into the ground. However, the economics of LTE are much easier to justify in very large countries or very developed, wealthy markets such as Hong Kong, or where you can come up with some kind of business model where there's a shared network resource, such as you saw in Sweden with that called Lily. Overall, in 2010, 12 commercial LTE services were launched in 2011, many years. Next slide, please. The next step, though, is really important. Let's not forget that device availability is really critical for LTE. Operators will not deploy a network that their customers can't access. So there's quite a few challenges remaining in this regard. Some of the challenges to the LTE device world is in the area of power consumption of the devices available today, size, integration with smart antennas, number of frequencies that are supported, and most important, bottom line, price. Bill? I hope you can see that. This is just a roadmap that we put out a couple of years ago, which I think is more or less still on track. Where in 2009, what you saw is the initial commercial LTE chipsets were beginning to be released by the chipset vendors. And then in 2010, external mobile devices or dongles were released to the mass market. What we're seeing late 2010, early 2011 is notebooks with embedded LTE chips and embedded modems. Late 2011 and into 2012, LTE handsets that may work for data only. And then voice over LTE handsets available possibly later this year, exactly when, and exactly what price points, supporting what frequencies and so on. That's a lot of open questions right now. The long-term vision, obviously, is LTE is going to be everywhere in all sorts of different devices, not just handsets, but if M2M really takes off, then we'll see the LTE chips from Qualcomm, ST Ericsson, Xera, Intel, Broadcom, Nemesis, and all sorts of other devices that we haven't discussed here, and that aren't really relevant to service provider business. But let's move on to the next slide, please. So just to wrap up before we go into the queue, before we bring on our panelists, at this point, LTE has more or less won as the future single standard for mobile services, and that's illustrated by the strong momentum behind LTE as demonstrated by roadmaps of operators that are actually deploying the networks, and by almost all vendors selling their equipment and planning R&D development. The LTE adoption, however, is mainly driven by greater cost efficiencies that technology expects to bring, rather than specific revenues that operators are expecting. The complication, or one of many complications, is that there's not going to be a single way or path of implementing LTE. It depends on a whole mix of specificities unique to each operator, unique to each country. The spectrum, what specific spectrum the regulator has issued, what your customer base is, the mix of data and voice traffic you have, and so on. It gets quite complex to analyze. One thing we didn't discuss, which the vendors have dealt with in terms of how they position their products, the big vendors, Ericsson, Huawei, Belarus, and so on, is that LTE implementation really requires planning at various levels in the organization, the operator organization. It's not just a RAN, radio access network issue. It cuts across your entire network because it's a revolution in terms of how you run your network. Transition to all IP. It affects your port, it affects your OSS, it affects billing, it affects marketing, many other things. For a range of reasons, LTE service takeoff will be quite gradual, much more gradual than the announcements and the press releases until late 2012, 2013.